Welcome back to my channel, Star Booze.
If blood ties may betray, what in this world, can we ever completely trust moment that made the entire planet pause? Its breath Rick Harrison, the Gleaming, the star of Pawn Stars, confessed in court a crime that caused the courtroom to freeze in shock. He ended his life. Own father, Richard Harrison. The beloved millions of viewers appreciate this number. His confession was cold and cutting. The blade cuts through the illusion of the ideal American family that the nation once cherished. What may have drove Rick to breach this moral line? Was insatiable greed festering? Contempt or a plan spun out? Of the darkest corners of the soul could exist. There could be even more terrifying truths waiting to be uncovered. Accompany us on a terrifying adventure to discover the unpleasant reality. Share your ideas in the comments. Underneath, hit like, subscribe to the channel to keep digging more into this horrific situation. In a moment when time seemed to stand still in the Las Vegas courtroom, broken into a horrible quiet. Simply the gasps of surprised spectators. Rick Harrison is the dazzling star of Pawn Stars, were once adored by millions, living icon of the American dream. Standing at the defendant's table, his hands shaking as they grasped the microphone. The face that was previously illuminated with a keen smile while negotiating historic treasures on TV was now warped, unspeakable. Pain. I did it, he muttered, shattering like broken glass. I ended my father, Richard Harrison's. Life's confession hit like a bomb. Detonating shockwaves via the courtroom jurors' lips dropped open. Some are concealing their faces in horror. Reporters hurried to record every. Their pens were shaking against each other. Notepads. Even the experienced judge had eyewitnessed several crimes while sitting, motionless disbelief etched across his face. The gavel hammered desperately for order, but it couldn't stop the rising. The wave of wrath and bewilderment surges. Through the only. A few years ago, Rick Harrison was the personification of triumph. He had changed the gold and silver pawn shop from a little storefront into a television empire, in which every item told. His razor-sharp ability to tell a historical story, bargaining skills, and down-to-earth charisma. Rick made audiences all over. The world believes he was the model son, standing proudly beside his father. Richard Oldman Harrison preserves the family legacy. Pawn Stars wasn't simply a show, it was a mark of loyalty, hard work, and family relationships. But now that image has crushed the guy audiences once admired has become a stranger and gloomy. They barely recognize Rick's confession didn't just ruin his repute, it tore up the shiny facade that had concealed the Harrison family's horrific truths. What had led to fame had blinded him into this abyss. Light has long been hiding fissures, and no one dared to witness the fissures within. The Harrisons didn't appear overnight. They were the product of decades of slow resentment burns like a little flame that soon burst into uncontrollable wildfire. Rick Harrison was formerly regarded as the right hand of his father, Richard Old Man. Harrison has spent his entire life trying to show his worth under the massive shadow of the iron-willed patriarch, but behind the dazzling. The success of Pawn Stars' connection. The relationship between the father and son was terrible. Battleground where blood ties existed, overwhelmed by ambition, resentment, deep-rooted injustice. Richard, a former Navy man with a steely demeanor, was typically treated with gold and silver pawn store as his personal impenetrable legacy, even while Rick converted the small business into a global television brand. Richard never granted him complete authority, as if Rick would forever be only an apprentice. That injustice exposed itself time and again. Richard's tough decisions are repeated once. In 2015, Rick proposed opening a branch in Los Angeles to capitalize on Pawn Star's enormous fame. Richard publicly shot him down in front of. The entire staff called it a foolish idea, and stating, "This shop only needs one leader, and it certainly isn't you." These remarks hurt Rick's dignity like he spent endless nights with the knife. Negotiating with television producers to bringing the family name to the global stage veteran staff remembered Rick departing. The meeting room, pale-faced fists, gripped, but yet pushing a strained smile for the cameras and the pattern. Repeating relentlessly, Richard Frankly Rick questioned sponsored arrangements. Secured, refused to raise his stock in firm, and even threatened to hand out transfer ownership to another relative if Rick did not learn his position as Richard's. Parkinson's disease led to a loss in health, sickness. The tension between them increased. Even more violent, despite Rick's handling almost everyday operation of both the shop and the show. Richard kept an iron grasp, observing everything through. Cold-cut phone calls are particularly the explosive turning point occurred in 2017, when Rick realized Richard had quietly changed his will, cutting Rick's inheritance and the transfer significant chunk of the estate becomes. Richard controls a charitable trust. Himself in a closed-door meeting at Richard's private home is decrepit, but Rick glanced up defiantly from his sickbed. Straight in the eyes and replied, "You're not mature enough to carry this legacy." These statements were not only a denial of Rick's years of sacrifice were the final hit ignited a wrath within him. This could no longer be contained. Financial conflicts ensued, and Rick demanded be handed 51% ownership of the shop. However, Richard declined, saying that Harrison's legacy will not fall into the hands of someone chasing money in Richard's last months when he was unable to leave his bed. His home turned become a battleground of legal maneuvering. Lawyers were continually coming and going. Rick was accused of pressuring him. Father will sign power transfer forms. When he was no longer completely lucid, a witness stated that late one night Rick yelled at his father, "I built everything. This, but you never acknowledged it." Rick possessed a sense of injustice. Combined with rising financial pressures from television contracts, expanding debts twisted him from Lokoyao's son became a man, fascinated with power the shop, traditionally a symbol of family. Loyalty became the fire that ate all Rick ever held precious. Richard's final months as an old guy, Harrison's life with Parkinson's disease. Rick is stuck within a failing body. Harrison was no longer an obedient son. He had once bowed before his father. Be a man divided between devotion and an insatiable yearning for power, plagued by sleepless nights with gloomy thoughts, crept into his head. The crushing weight of operating the gold and silver pawn store, negotiating multi-million-dollar television deals, and satisfying the expectations. Millions of watchers focused on Rick's shoulders, but the most severe pain came from realizing that, no matter how much, he sacrificed and became nothing more, a shadow beneath his father's. Highlight every refusal, Richard's doubtful glare slashed like a Rick had a knife as a continuous reminder, never truly acknowledged as was the true successor to his empire, contributed to the development of resentment. Over decades, it gradually hardened into a killy determined plan. Rick's sharp. The thought had once helped him close. Massive bargains on Pawn Stars began to plot each move with frightening precision. He realized that Richard's death had to be revealed, natural and ordinary end for a man whose body had already been devastated. Unwell during his travels, Rick silently went to his father's secluded residence. Analyzed Richard's dosages. He pored over Parkinson's medication medical journals, learning how overdose minor but deliberate could accelerate the demise of a feeble body, without arousing suspicion about that. One tragic night, while the world stood still believed. Rick was the loving son, caring. For his sick father, he cooked a stronger than usual dose and swirled it into Richard's water. "This will help you. Sleep better," he urged, his voice calm. Richard's eyes were very cold. Weary and unprepared, they drank it all. He was discovered dead in his bed this morning. Doctors attributed the death to age. And disease Rick's plan unfolded. He effortlessly contacted the family lawyer. Before notifying the hospital, make sure all legal documentation were in place. To cede complete control of the shop. Social media posts have been systematically planned to paint an image of. The sad son conceals the knowledge that he had organized everything from the shadows remain. Behind that merciless cunning was a man tortured with guilt. The subsequent sleepless nights were not. They were afraid about getting caught, haunted by recollections of a father who once showed him how to hold his first ring, but who had also made him feel he would never be good enough, Rick admonished himself. Richard performed an act of mercy. I would not have wished to live in constant pain, yet deep inside he knew it was a lie. It wasn't merely the end for his father. Rick bought it as a liberation, at the expense of an unforgivable betrayal. Workplace pressures from tense meetings with producers to maintain Rick's perfect public image has changed. He became a stranger to himself once. He dreamed about the day when his father pat him on the shoulder and say, "You did." Well, that dream never came true. Instead, hatred and ambition drove him to make a lousy selection a choice, as he later admitted in court that shocked the entire globe that action is not only took Richard's life, but also triggered a disaster that will devastate everything Rick once held dear. The last days of Richard Oldman Harrison was anything from peaceful. Image of a father surrounded by affection, of his family rather than his Las Vegas home become a suffocating battleground. Arguments about wills and inheritance erupted like endless storms. Parkinson's illness had snatched Richard's strength, as reduced him to the shadow of the former ruler gold and silver pawn shop with he rarely left his bed and spoke in a razor-sharp voice. His hands trembled too much to hold a pen, and his gaze remained penetrating, challenging anyone who dared to cross him. Iron Rick Harrison was no longer in that space. He was no longer the dedicated son he always was. The calculating figure is always presented with stacks of legal papers and a look he never left his father's family. Tensions reached a breaking point. Rick is accused of manipulating his father during his weakest moments. Evening in late 2018. Richard's awareness faded. Rick carried a packet documents modifying the will and requested Richard's father will sign as a witness. The private nurse later testified that Rick whispered into his father's ear, "This is for the benefit of the family, Dad." Richard was fatigued and apprehensive. Eventually signed, possibly because he no longer had the strength to resist. The new document removed Rick's two siblings lose their inheritance rights, giving complete possession of the pawn. Shop and major assets into Rick's other family members are forbidden. From seeing Richard without Rick's, supervisors were only made aware of the modifications. Following his death, arguments erupted in hospital corridors were crowded with shouting and tears when Rick's siblings accused him of taking the legacy from a dying father. The atmosphere within Richard's home, it became so terrible that even attorneys labored in silence. Rick communicates only through glances. Apparent calm controlled every meeting, but within him boiled a maelstrom of guilt. His manipulation was not without conflict, only about power. It was a desperate attempt to ultimately demonstrate his worth. To a father who had not completely recognized, Richard closed his eyes forever. There were no arms of family surrounding him, only loneliness and secrets, ready to explode and demolish. Everything about Rick Harrison's confession in court wasn't just a bombshell that ruined his personal reputation. There was a fire that consumed what little remains of the Harrison family once. America holds up the ideal of Rick spoke about kinship and unity. Chilling admission that he ended his father's life in court wasn't only flooded by the banging of gavels. Calling for order, it was filled with Corey hears the sound of blood ties shattering. Rick's son sat in the gallery with him. His head was bowed and his shoulders were trembling. "Grief. I've lost my grandfather and now my entire family," he wrote in heartbreaking social media post after the trial, his words cutting deeply into the hearts of Pawn Stars fans everywhere. Rick's siblings had long stayed out. Of the spotlight has now moved forward. Fueled by rage, they could no longer contain launching lawsuits that rocked public opinion. The Harrison family, once a symbol of unity, had turned brutal. Rick's older brother is on the legal battlefield. Joseph led the charge accusing Rick of elder abuse and of manipulating Richard's will in his dying days. Another lawsuit filed by their sister, Sherry, sought to overturn the final will Rick had forced their father to sign, backed by evidence from a nurse attesting that Richard was no longer mentally competent. At the time, the courtrooms turned into heartbreaking battlegrounds where siblings who once shared family dinners now faced each other like bitter enemies. "Rick stole our father and stole the family's legacy," Joseph declared. To the press, his voice shaking with rage. The lawsuits weren't just about reclaiming assets. They were about reclaiming Richard's honor, which they believed had been betrayed by his son in his most vulnerable moment. Outside the courtroom, the Pawn Stars empire crumbled like a sand castle before a raging tide. The gold and silver pawn shop, once bustling with tourists lining up for photos, had become a cold ghost town, with dusty shelves and employees working insolence. Broadcast platforms pulled Pawn Stars from their catalogs. Sponsorship deals were canceled, and merchandise bearing Rick's image from T-shirts to bobbleheads was either dumped or fire sold by furious fans on social media. The hashtag #NumberCancel. Pawn Stars flooded. The feeds accompanied by heartbreaking comments. "I used to think they were the perfect family. Turns out it was all a lie the fan community once captivated by." The history behind every item now turned, their backs feeling betrayed by the glittering facade Rick had constructed. The legal consequences loomed over Rick like a sentence before the official verdict. Prosecutors, armed with confessions and legal documents, demanded the maximum penalty, calling Rick's actions an unforgivable betrayal. Meanwhile, his defense team fought for leniency, citing psychological strain and the lifelong ache of never earning his father's approval. But in the eyes of both his family and the public, Rick was no longer the beloved hero of Pawn Stars. She had become a blood traitor, someone who destroyed not just his father, but the very legacy that once bound them. Together, when the television lights went dark, all that remained was ruin and wounds that would never heal. To understand why Rick Harrison, once seen as a symbol of the American dream, had fallen into the abyss of betrayal, one must look deep into the tormented soul behind his public smile. Rick grew up under the harsh discipline of Richard Old Man Harrison, a loving but unforgiving father who women set expectations like steel walls, impossible to breach. Every one of Rick's failures, no matter how tiny, was met with a glance of disappointment that sown seeds of self-doubt he would never be able to uproot. Even after creating the Pawn Stars empire, Rick remained tormented by the notion that he was never good enough, continually yearning for a moment of recognition, a time his father would never grant. Psychologists evaluating Rick's confession described the event as a classic instance of dual loyalty. Conflict. Rick both adored the father who had taught him everything about business and despised the man who had trapped him in an overpowering shadow. Every compliment the public gave Richard everything. The denial of Rick's suggestions fueled the flames of his mute wrath, tore him apart. Between his obligation as a devoted son and his desire to be free from father's control and become his own man, That stifling sense of being, trapped mixed with the crushing pressures of fame and responsibility, gradually turned. Rick became a stranger to his own conscience. Rick's horrible deed wasn't a brief outburst, it was the culmination of psychic wounds, festering over decades, he once dreamed. In a moment when his father would pay the shoulder and say, "You are my pride." However, that ideal was replaced by a harsh inactuality. Richard never saw him a suitable successor, that terrible hunger. The thirst for approval is never satisfied. Rick's moral boundaries were blurred, which led he came to a catastrophic judgment, that he destroyed not just his father but also family and the legacy he once deeply cherished. Rick Harrison's decline. It's not merely the narrative of a broken family, is a strong warning about the dark side of reality. TV Pawn Stars were once captivated millions in the image of a united. The Harrison family has ancient treasures, shared stories of commitment and hard effort. The trial tore apart that delusion, exposing deep conflicts that have long been concealed by writing and carefully modifying reality. TV, once promised authenticity, proved to be little more than the expertly created illusion leaves thee. The public feels misled by their idols. Harrison disintegrated before their eyes. The narrative has become a modern tragedy. Brutal testimony to the price of Rick became caught up in ambition and betrayal. His desire for fame and power was gone. Not only his father, but the American cultural icon for their family, had come to signify. The scandal poses a serious question. Is it worth sacrificing family for fame? The true cost of living under their relentlessly highlight the Harrison legacy. Once a proud symbol, today stands as a harsh reminder that even the strongest, perfect families can hide wounds too. This lawsuit did not just ending a TV show, destroyed a national illusion, leaving a hard-earned lesson on loyalty, morality, and the fragility of fame. Rick Harrison today exists as a single shadow imprisoned, not simply by imposing prison walls, but by the enmity of family and public, like the man who once shone under thee. The lights of Pawn Stars are now hidden from the world, living in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Las Vegas, where every day is a struggle against the crushing weight of guilt makes him miss not just the life he took his father's inheritance, but ruined the once powerful family enterprise. The scornful filled him with pride. Strangers' relentless glances, curses on social media, and the ice. The quiet of his son, Corey, and his siblings sliced at his spirit like knives. Family members continue to file lawsuits, pile up with Rick's siblings, determined to reverse the will and seek justice. For Richard, investigators' Combercords are looking for evidence of financial manipulation of gold, and the silver pawn shop was once the beating heart of an empire is now in ruins beyond. The Pawn Stars brand is dead, and Rick, the man who once dreamt of glory, is left only with loneliness and regret. A future with no way out.